agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, like a Fox News host, I guess I'm just happy to be here.
So, oh, very nice. Very, very topical. I like that. And that is definitely something we're going to talk about, along with some Supreme Court stuff, the debt ceiling measure the House passed, Disney suing DeSantis, and Biden announcing for 2024. Well, there's a whole lot, and I haven't even mentioned the Donald Trump rape trial, but we were going to get to some of that, certainly, at least, and we're going to get started with that in just 1 second. All right, Jay. So on last week's show, we weren't able to discuss the Supreme Court staying a lower court ruling that restricted access to the abortion drug Mifepristone, which preserved access to it until the case works its way through the appeals process. And in that case, Justices Alito and Thomas dissented. Now, Thomas dissented without comment, but Alito actually did issue a dissent. And in that dissent, Justice Alito wrote, in part, the government has not dispelled legitimate doubts that it would even obey an unfavorable order in these cases, much less that it would choose to take enforcement actions to which it has strong objections. And here he was possibly referring to Health and Human Services Secretary Xavier Becerra, who, during a CNN interview, when he was asked if he would recommend that the FDA ignore the ban, said, everything is on the table. Though later that day, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre told reporters, look, we are going to always follow the law, always. Now, there's a related issue that Ken and Trey got into.
That's not quite a denial. But
well, I mean, we'll get into that. But there's this related issue, and Trey and Ken got into this a few weeks back, and that's whether the FDA exercising its discretion and choosing to not prosecute anyone distributing Mifepristone in defiance of that court order would actually be ignoring the ruling. But either way, Alito's point would still stand, which is that the court, in his words, would simply refuse to take a step that has not been shown as necessary to avoid the threat of any real harm during the presumably short period at issue. And by which Alito was referring to the fast tracking of the government's appeal at the Fifth Circuit. So, Jay, a couple of things. First, what do you think about the court granting the stay? Because Alito and Thomas were the only two who objected to that. And secondly, I wanted to get your take on Alito's thoughts on his sole dissent. And I say sole dissent because presumably if Thomas agreed with Alito's reasoning, Thomas would have joined that dissent. So,
yeah.
First, with the court granting the stay, do you think that was the right move?
I think it was for a number of reasons. But as I'll say in a minute, I think Alito's not wrong, right? I think, we're often, you and I talk a lot about Chevron deference and various forms of deference, and I'm a deference skeptic for a lot of reasons. But in something like this, I would say if there is an application for agency deference, it would be in this type of case, right, where the FDA is saying a medication or something is safe, effective, can be sold. I think that's because, again, that comes down to more a technical question within the FDA's sphere of knowledge rather than a bigger policy question, which is often what, so often these deference cases come down to. So I get that. And I think given when you're seeking to do something on this level, this type of injunction, it is sort of extraordinary relief that you're seeking, right? It would upend the lives of a lot of people. And you balance that against, listen, this has been the status quo for quite some time beforehand. And, what's likely to happen Where's the greater harm in terms of upending the status quo during these couple weeks while we get through the appeal and it comes up on the regular docket, or at least you get a decision versus essentially second guessing the administrative agency without all the facts in front of you. So I get that.
And especially,
idea.
This has been a status quo that's been in place for quite a while. And I know you've been pretty consistent over time is saying that if the court, when the court is being asked to do something, especially in their emergency docket, when they haven't had a chance to review the evidence, that the presumption should be in favor of not doing anything, of not upsetting the status quo unless there is compelling evidence to do so, right?
Yeah. And that's just not my opinion. That's sort of that's kind of the law, really. So yeah, I understand and get where it's coming. And also I would like to, put it out there. And I know you're not one of these people who says this, but for all the clamoring that one often hears from the left about the Supreme Court being illegitimate and ideologically blinkered and pretty soon all women will be wearing burqas and so forth. This would seem to stand as counter evidence, right? That they're applying the law on the merits, even though it's not really the merits because it's still sort of a procedural ruling, but they're applying the procedural law on the merits rather than a preordained political outcome. Now that said, like I said, I don't think Alito's wrong in terms of raising complaints just about how the shadow docket is. And I put the shadow docket in the silly scare quotes. It's not. There's nothing particularly shadowy about it. It's just that it's emergency. It's stuff that comes up right away and is necessarily done without all of the briefing, all of the argument that you would have in a full-fledged court decision.
But in this case, I wonder. In this case, though, you would think then that it's Justices Alito and Thomas who are the judicial activists here, and the other 7 who are kind of going by that standard burden of saying, well, the status quo should stand unless there is compelling evidence, right? And so it's kind of.
Although, I mean, what Alito hits at is less that and more just of I think he's taking shots at other members of the court who had who would have been more interventionary in other cases. That says, look, if we should have taken these issued stays in other cases, then we should issue this stay here.
It's all right if you do it, but not when I do it. Yeah, I get you.
Yeah, so it's just arguing for sort of a procedural consistency. And I'm trying to find the exact words, but it's sort of look, if that was the case in whatever, I'm pulling it up here, then certainly it should be the case here. And again, he's one of those when you're doing a dissent on a procedural issue, you've got sort of free reign to know that, look, nothing's going to happen here, but you can just kind of take the take the shot of, look, if we're going to do these types of things, we ought to be consistent in doing it.
Except, when we're talking about consistency, I think we need to be clear what we're talking about. That's not to say the court should always grant stays or always not. And so we're talking about consistency in terms of applying the rule, applying the standard consistently. And now reasonable people can differ on this. And I think you and I actually, even though we may differ on the underlying reproductive rights issue, we both agree that the majority made the right decision here. And so in that sense, so I guess the issue I have with Alito's dissent is when he talks about the government has not dispelled legitimate doubts that would even obey an unfavorable order. My first thought is, well, wait a second, then is the presumption that the government will not obey an order? Because that seems to be what Alito was suggesting. And the idea that there are legitimate doubts here, I find to be highly questionable, given that the White House said we will always obey the law, always. That's about as strong a statement. I think if you're going to make an argument from the court that, well, we won't issue a stay because we think the government's going to behave lawlessly, that's a pretty strong claim. And you need a whole lot more than some backbenchers and a statement that was quickly walked back from HHS secretary to justify that. And that's where I think Alito got way too far out on a limb here.
So I disagree a little on that, because to me, I don't think the response by Katrina Jean-Pierre was really definitive. She didn't say we will agree or follow what the Supreme Court says. Right. There's sort of this wiggle room of we'll follow the law. But if that illegitimate majority gets it wrong, obviously we're not going to follow that law.
See,
right?
I think
that's how I read it. And that's how I think Alito read it.
I think that is such a tortured reading. If you're going to be a textualist, look, we are always going to follow the law always is about as strong and general a statement as you can possibly make. I understand what you're saying, but I think that reading only works if you are starting from a presumption of bad faith.
But look at stuff like DACA, right? Look at there. I mean, there are a number of other. Look at the student loan cases. Look at the. Some of these. I would say the Clean Power Plan, but the idea that the administration sat down and said, okay, how can we insulate this from judicial review? How can we insulate these decisions from judicial review? And we're always going to follow the law. That's to me. I think that's. That's concerning, and
even granting that, let's say I grant that, okay, but even so, making this case that we will not grant a stay because there is a possibility that the government will ignore us because in certain instances the government has used discretion to not prosecute in certain instances, sometimes broadly, like you said, with the DACA, or as the argument Ken made with the federal government not prosecuting marijuana crimes at the federal level, right? And so using that as the basis to say, well, no harm will be suffered because there's a chance that the government won't enforce this law or will use their discretion, that is pretty thin gruel, I think. And so I think that's why Alito was alone in this, because even the other justices who might be at least sympathetic in terms of policy and might have some doubts about the government's willingness to, go along, even they thought, wow, that's kind of out there, Sam. I mean, so yeah, I think there's a reason why it was a lone dissent, and I think the rest of the court, even the other conservatives, were right not to join with that, which I think is just kind of beyond the pale a little bit.
Okay. Well, my other point I was going to make was, and I sort of started to make it, but then I got myself sidetracked. He says, listen, because in this case, the shadow docket essentially did grant relief, right, in issuing a stay. And he said, listen, that practice has come under criticism from many other justices in other cases, saying this is inappropriate to use the shadow docket this way. And he goes on to say, look, if those complaints were appropriate then, they're certainly appropriate now. And I think he's right there. You can't sort of have it both ways and say, oh my gosh, it's terrible that we would use this shadow docket to make decisions on big things without full briefing and so forth. But then sometimes you do it. So that's where I am, right? I think you can. This is going to sound weird, but I think I can agree with Alito, and also agree that the court probably got it right on the merits, again, the procedural merits. as it were. So
yeah, you can grant that I may disagree with you on this, but I see your general point saying that, well, it's not that what Alito is saying is completely wrong and illegitimate. It's just that on balance, you feel that, yeah. And so I think that's
yeah, Alito's can just kind of calling out some other colleagues to say, listen, if you're going to do this, let's be consistent.
And you know, I think
raising to me, and again, we would disagree on this. I think that I think there is a genuine concern about whether the government would, because there are other statements. I'm trying to think, was the senator from Washington sort of urged resistance, the idea of if the
not that they're not part of the executive branch, and so they have no.
Exactly. No, that's fair. But they're from the same party as the executive branch, and I would expect share some of the same sentiments. But.
Well, you know, I mean, you're from the same party as Donald Trump, so I don't know that we necessarily. But anyway, I wanted to make a larger point on this, and I think what a lot of people, listeners of the show, probably appreciate this. But there's only been actually one full case on this that has been decided, and that's at the district court level. And everything else that's happened so far has been through this shadowy emergency, right? I mean, the Fifth Circuit and now the Supreme Court and so forth. And so I think really people do that scare quotey sort of thing. But, you know, it's the process isn't that scary. And I think I'm with you in saying that, well, no, I mean, there's a reason why we have this, right? To make sure that there is no harm that is irreparable harm that is suffered while a case is being appealed. And I don't have any problem with this. And I think when we talk about, well, why do we see maybe more activity on this shadow docket, horrible name, right? Is that, well, when you have more of these contentious issues being raised, that's naturally going to happen. And I don't know that it's a bad thing. I think you could argue that it's actually a good thing in the system operating in the appropriate way.
Well, I think maybe it's not a bad or a good thing, right? I think it is the system operating the way it's supposed to. But maybe it is a symptom of a bigger political problem. Right, just a sharply divided country, and issues being resolved essentially by executive order that are extremely controversial, that open themselves up to this immediate challenge, and it coming from both sides. So I can say it's sort of a I don't think it's necessarily indicative of national health that you see a whole lot of these. But I don't blame the court for it. The court's just sort of like the immune system responding to this, right? There's a fever because there's something else going on. Yeah,
I think that's a great analogy. Absolutely. All right, well, let's move on to something entirely different, actually. In a party line vote this week, with all but 4 Republicans in favor and all Democrats opposed, the House of Representatives on Wednesday approved the Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023. And this is legislation that would, first off, raise the debt ceiling by $1.5 trillion or through March of 2024, whichever comes first, cut discretionary spending to 2022 levels, adding a 1% yearly growth cap for the next decade, claw back unspent COVID aid, and block President Biden's student debt relief plan, rescind the $71 billion or so that Congress previously appropriated to the IRS to upgrade technology and boost hiring, repeal or modify tax credits for renewable and clean energy, energy-efficient property, alternative fuels, electric vehicles, establish new work requirements for Medicaid and expand work requirements for SNAP and temporary assistance for needing families, and require that major federal rules, and that's defined here as rules likely to result in an annual economic effect of at least $100 million, be approved by Congress before they take effect. So there's a lot there. And this measure is, of course, dead on arrival in the Democratic-controlled Senate. And President Biden has repeatedly said that he would not negotiate over the debt ceiling and has demanded a clean bill that only involves raising the debt ceiling and not that laundry list of other things that I just read off that House Republicans have attached to it. So, Jay, what do you think? Is this the start of negotiations between House Republicans, Senate Democrats, and the White House? Or do you think that Biden is going to stick to his position of not negotiating, basically kind of continuing the game of chicken?
I would hope it's the beginning of negotiations. There's going to be some pressure on some Democrats when it comes to, you're telling me, you won't accept, slashing the federal budget to 2022 levels, or capping a 1% growth for this period for 1 year. And again, the 1% growth in discretionary spending, right? No entitlements are touched and so forth. I think those are good issues to run on. Those are good issues to campaign on and make speeches on. Some of the other pieces, the work requirements, that's widely popular in a lot of places, and that's a tough thing to oppose. The student loan piece, I think that's probably more something that could be given away, negotiated away. There's no way Biden's going to give that up, I don't think. But I do think Biden is, at his peril if he says I'm not going to negotiate, because at some point, if we're getting away from the president can say, I want to increase the debt ceiling, I don't want any strings attached. We're starting to blur our lines of separation of powers. Look, Congress is supposed to be in charge of the budget. The president obviously has a veto, but at some point it's showing sort of a lack of respect if you're not going to at least engage in negotiations. Now, I think that this proposal gives the president a lot of room to negotiate, right? And there's also a point of if you're going to blame this on someone, it's going to be a tougher. I mean, the media will help and will do a good job of it of blaming House Republicans for this, but they've produced a bill that ups the debt ceiling with strings that some of them I get are never going to be agreed to, but some of them seem to be pretty reasonable compromises. So my sense is he'll negotiate, although he won't call it negotiation, right? There'll be a way out to say, listen, we can agree to this and this and this. But I'm still standing firm against these terrorists.
Yeah, well, I think that it seems to me that a number of these provisions were clearly included so that Kevin McCarthy could actually get the initial majority he needed to start negotiations. Like, for instance, the repealing or modifying those energy tax credits. That's not going to happen. That a number of those things aren't going to happen.
Yeah, I'd agree. Those are giveaways. Those are things you get people on board and then eventually would be given away.
But see, I don't even know that they're giveaways, because I think that given the slim nature of the Republican majority and the necessity to bring on so many kind of conservative Freedom Caucus hardliners, that it might be difficult to negotiate those away and still get the votes you need necessarily. I'm not sure, but I guess I would say that, like, for instance, you can say, well, okay, raising the debt ceiling, combining the debt ceiling with spending cuts or limiting the growth of spending. Those two things naturally go together. The rest of it is, and maybe you throw in the clawback of the unspent COVID aid, okay, reasonable.
Yeah.
But the rest of it is just all, well, what can we get Freedom Caucus member X, Y, and Z to basically say that they were able to get in that kind of thing. So, but also just the nature of the raising the debt ceiling, right? Through March of 2024 or 1.5 trillion, whichever comes first. In other words, let's set up another fight on this in the heat of the presidential election year. I mean, this is pretty clearly, this is just as much a political document and not a serious legislative proposal as, say, the president's initial budget is every year. And I think everyone should understand it as that. There's no way that House Republicans said, oh, this is what we think we're going to get.
No, and that's, I would agree. And that's, if McCarthy is smart, and look, he's smart enough to be speaker, although there are some curveballs that his caucus can throw him. My sense is he would have gone into this saying, this is understanding this is our negotiating position. This is not our drop dead offer. If it is the drop dead offer, well, then I think we've got a problem. And I think what happens at the end of the day is enough Republicans would peel off and vote for a clean debt ceiling to avoid a default.
And again, you don't really need that many Republicans to vote for it in the first place. I mean, as long as, say, I don't think McCarthy would go for anything that couldn't get a majority of his caucus, but you can easily build a coalition with the majority of the Republican caucus and enough Democrats. So this is not
exactly. That's what I'm saying. You can give away some of this, like the IRS funding, which I think you can argue is properly for another day, right? And some of these other subsidies, those probably should be standalone bills. But yeah, you can give those away and then still maybe get enough vulnerable Democrats who will join you on things like, okay, keep the work requirement and, sort of the budget stability and the growth limit for the next year. So yeah, I think it's a smart move politically, and I think it's smart policy wise as well. And we'll just, and again, if McCarthy's, half as smart as I think he is, he would have done the numbers and done the counting and kind of know where he stands in terms of being able to deliver votes at the end of the day.
I think if I'm in Biden's position, at least this is what I would try to do in this position. I wouldn't negotiate on a 1 year raising the ceiling, and I sure wouldn't negotiate or agree to raising it just until the middle of the presidential election campaign.
Oh yeah, no, that's a political trap, obviously. Yeah,
but I might say, well, you know what? I'm willing to consider negotiating on some significant spending cuts in exchange for doing away with the debt ceiling entirely, pointing out maybe that there's only one other advanced country that has a debt ceiling, and that's Denmark, and it actually works a little bit differently. And so not only that, but the argument that, hey, if we agree to take on debt, why should we have a debate every year about whether or not we're going to pay the bills that we took on, whether we're going to honor our obligations? Because, hey, real Americans, we keep our word, we pay our debts, and these are separate issues. I think that's a clear, strong argument. And I think it would be worthwhile to take this off the table because, of course, this has been something that Freedom Caucus, Tea Party, before that, Tea Party folks have used every year when there's been a Democrat in office to try to extract these concessions. And I think it's a very dangerous kind of game. And I wouldn't be surprised, for instance, if we end up, if negotiations get to the point where maybe there's a default for a day or two. And you might say, well, so what? But that can have some really significant economic repercussions that can have real effects in people's lives. And so now that might politically work to the advantage of Republicans. You could say that, well, hey, if we can engineer I
don't think so. No. I don't think it would ever. So, I mean, you mentioned that I don't see Biden doing that because I think that's sort of a losing gambit for him. I think if you look at these other debt ceiling fights, how many can you really say that Republicans won? Maybe the sequester issue back in the Obama era, right, where there was the sequestration, and
but even that the spending didn't really.
World's going to, that's what I'm saying. They didn't win, and there was a sequester, but it didn't do a whole lot. Democrats said the world will end, and it didn't. What it did do is probably decrease some military spending that we could probably wish we had now.
And non-military,
but no, I wish we had the military. But my point is that that's where I think it was.
It's easy.
Look, they got sort of a win, but what I'm saying is I don't think this has been a great tool for Republicans, and I think it's a better tool for Democrats because they can just keep borrowing the money, and spending the money. And then when the debt ceiling comes, say, hey, we got to pay our debts. You don't want to be like one of these Republicans who won't pay our debts. All we're trying to do is, keep our obligations and so forth. And then they'll just go back to making more and more obligations. And then,
but of course, it works. Right. It works both ways because.
And I'm not saying Republicans aren't complicit in that. That's, again, obviously a big pet peeve of with me and a lot of Republicans out there is that Republicans are happy to spend this money. So I'm. Which is why,
yes. It's I think in a way easy. Well, not easy, but easier to agree to future spending cuts because the current Congress can't bind future Congresses. So even if you have caps, as we saw with the Obama caps, subsequent Congress can say, well, you know what, we're going to vote to actually do away with those, and there's nothing you can do about that. And so certainly you can say, well, okay, we'll have these caps, but then a year or two or 3 or 4 years, Congress says, well, the Republicans say, well, we need more money for defense spending. Well, we can still do that. And so it's easy to agree to something, you can always change if the need arises. And so that's why I think there will be some sort of a deal, but again, I would not be surprised if there were a day or two of default sometime this summer. But I think the pressure that markets will put on both parties, the moderates from both parties, is just going to be too much for this to be, like a significant issue for any period of time.
Yeah, I don't think there will be I don't think President Biden will use the word negotiate, except to say, I will not negotiate with terrorists.
I don't think he'll call them terrorists, but go ahead.
I do. No, please. Let's check back in a week.
Okay,
check back
fair enough.
And I think there will be some, maybe not Biden, but there will be.
Sure.
Someone on in Congress.
Okay, that's fair.
Senator who will say these are terrorists, intent on burning down our country and returning us to the dark ages of 2022. I think rather it will be something, the big statement of I'm not negotiate, I'm not going to pressure, I need a clean bill. And but you know what? I'm all for work requirement. Well, no, I guess he can't really say that because he called that idea wacko, even though he had proposed it and voted for it years ago. But he'll take some pieces of that and sort of try to say this is my idea, this is my proposal, integrate them into the response and take it from there. But I don't think there will be hey, let's sit down and negotiate.
Well, yeah, I think you're right that the messaging is going to won't be that. Now, you mentioned that, just as an aside, you mentioned the work requirements as being something that so many people accept. And I would say yes and no. I think very much the devil is in the details here. And there have been a number of states, for instance, in which they've been generally almost, I think, exclusively or largely Republican-controlled states where work requirements were designed in such a way to place a pretty significant burden on people that really, to a lot of us on the left, seems more like a way of trying to make it really difficult for people that the burden is on them to a ridiculous level to try to just basically cut welfare rules as opposed to ensure that people are making a reasonable effort. And so to me, I'm not against work requirements in some instances, but I think a lot really depends on how they're structured, because what does that mean? I mean, there has to be some sort of reporting. How do you decide whether or not somebody is actually making a real effort? And that can be either pretty strict, pretty draconian, or it can be pretty lax. And that's where I think there are some significant differences. So just saying, well, there should be work requirements. Okay, fine. But how are you going to structure those? That makes a lot of difference to people who are receiving this assistance.
No, and I agree with that to some extent. But if you look back, this is not dissimilar from the Clintonian end of welfare as we know it. Right. And that, I would say most people would say was a policy success in the mid 90s. That we trimmed the welfare rolls, got more people back to work, and more importantly, got more people engaged in the economy. Right. You had people who were just outside, and now people are trained, they're getting jobs, they're participating. Because I think a whole lot of other social pathologies go with that. That's something that the welfare reform looked at back then. There's there are advantages to having a job beyond just getting a paycheck. And I think that's important, whether it's a job or whether it's whatever, some kind of training that you have to go to or looking for a job. And let's be frank, some of this is designed to make the receipt of welfare benefits more of a pain than getting a job. Right? It is putting burdens and hurdles up to say, you know, there are people who miss, well, screw this, I might as well get a job. And that's going to come across harsh, but I think there's some reality to that. If you look at just the numbers, and if you look at all the help wanted signs are still out there. It's not that we're in a deep recession where there are no jobs to be had.
Right. I hear what you're saying, and I agree. There is sometimes an important advantage to what you might call tough love, but there's also a point at which the line between tough love and cruelty starts to blur a little bit. And I think that's where Democrats and Republicans often disagree. I know you see it as, well, like I said, tough love, whereas and to a certain extent that may be true, but I think it can go into when you hear some people, some people are not you arguing that, well, we just need to get these bums off the doles, and that it starts to feel like a form of kind of cruelty. So
I get it. But keep in mind what we're talking about in this bill, as it was the case in the Clinton welfare reform. We're talking about able-bodied adults without children, you know. So it's not it isn't the disabled single mother who you're throwing off welfare. It's people who there's no, you know, physical reason, or let's even say other disability, mental disability reason that they can't get a job. It's not that they can't get a job because they're staying at home taking care of kids. And I think, again, it's a tougher argument to make if you're in a deep recession. If this was 2010 or something like that, and there are jobs have dried up, but we're not in a recession, at least not yet.
But there's a good chance that there's a good chance that we.
I think we're heading that way.
A better than average chance that we will be in one before the end of this year, at least according to the Conference Board and other analysts. But yeah, it's not. So yeah, I think I agree. I think I agree generally speaking. I think in the end, I expect that I certainly don't think there will be any kind of agreement to do away with the debt ceiling. That's kind of my dream, but that's not what Biden would have to give up, what Democrats would have to give up to get that would be pretty significant, I would expect. I think the only realistic chance for that to happen would be if you get a point where there are large enough Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate and the Democratic president. Maybe you could push that through, but there are too many Republicans who see this as great leverage to try to get what they feel to be.
No, too many Republicans like it, and too many Democrats like it because they can see it as, listen, we can keep spending all the money we want as long as we put it on the credit card. You know what I mean? It's sort of that way. As long as it's debt spending, then we know we'll be okay because, you know, we got to pay the debt.
Right. Because the Democrats are fine with borrowing and Republicans are too, really, because as we've talked about a million times before, it's a lot easier to actually, spend than to pay for your spending, however you want to do it. And both parties are complicit in that, certainly. All right. Well, let's move on to, from the truly important to the, I don't know if it calls ridiculous exactly, but it certainly descended into some wildness. This week, the Disney company, they filed a lawsuit against Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, as well as a bunch of other top Florida officials, alleging that the state's move to revoke the company's special district was part of what they termed a targeted campaign of government retaliation. Now, in response to this, the DeSantis spokesperson said the governor's office is unaware of any legal right that a company has to operate its own government or maintain special privileges not held by other businesses in the state. So this all started, I'll remind everyone, back when Disney criticized the state's so-called Don't Say Gay measure, which restricted teachers from discussing issues related to sexual orientation or gender identity which DeSantis signed into law of March of 2022. I'll also mention that
you should add, because I need to add it.
Yeah, please do.
In the appropriate manner. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I should add then that this law, which initially only applied up to the third grade, this month was expanded to cover all grades at DeSantis's request. So no more age inappropriate. It's pretty much any age. But anyway, a little more than a month after that, the Florida legislature passes a measure that rescinds Disney's special improvement district status, despite concerns from local governments that they'd have to raise taxes to provide these services. It cost around $1 billion at one point, they said. So that in turn led the legislature to repeal the law. But in the interim, Disney and the still existing Reedy Creek Improvement District Board had assigned agreements concerning long-term development rights, which now I should point out these agreements also didn't restrict the ability of the state to impose taxes, reject building permits, exercise eminent domain, or otherwise regulate Disney. But the media narrative here was that Disney had beaten DeSantis, had humiliated DeSantis in getting these agreements. And so the legislature and DeSantis said, well, this can't stand. So they created a new oversight body, the Central Florida Tourism Oversight Board, with members handpicked by DeSantis, which promptly voided these agreements made between Disney and the previous board. And literally minutes after that decision by the new board, Disney filed suit in federal court. Now, Disney is alleging that DeSantis and these other officials named in the lawsuit have violated the Constitution's Contracts Clause, the Takings Clause, the Due Process Clause, and the First Amendment free speech rights of the company. And they're asking that the contracts made between the company and the previous board remain in effect, and that essentially all of the legislation passed by the state related to this be declared unlawful and unenforceable. And the case is being heard by Judge Mark Walker, an Obama appointee who is the chief judge for the Northern District of Florida. So there's a lot of back and forth there, right? A lot going on. But Jay, I thought maybe we'd start with this, the legal case. What do you think, based on what you've seen from Disney's complaint, about their chances of actually winning in court on any of these claims?
So, to me, I think this is a little bit plowing some unplowed ground. I think there's a couple ways you can look at what they're claiming. If this was and I think the key weird fact is that Disney is the only one with this designation, right? And
actually, let me stop here. That they're actually
you're going to
not,
say there are other organizations.
In fact, there are some huge special districts that have self-governing rights. So yeah, there are somewhere over that. There are well over 1,000. I forget how many. So now not all of them are this big, but there are also some pretty big ones. So that would be. I just wanted to put that in there. But go ahead.
Well, all in Florida though.
Yeah, in Florida, over 1,000, I believe. Yeah, I get the specific number, but yeah, they have a lot of special districts.
All right. Well, then in that case, that makes DeSantis' hand, I would think, weaker.
Well, not only that, but I would say, for instance, when DeSantis actually has, gone on the record as saying that, hey, if you're woke, you're broke, that sort of thing. And if you go up against the state, we will hit back against you. These are the sort of public comments that really make it difficult, I think, to not argue that there is government retaliation here. Right? Oh,
no, I would agree with you 100%. It's retaliatory. My question would be, is it permissibly retaliatory?
Sure. Okay.
And that's what gets into the thing of, if the government gives you a special benefit, does that entitle the government to continue that special benefit ad infinitum? And can't the government simply get rid of that? Aren't you essentially a benefit recipient at will if it's specially geared towards you? So, for example, and this is the frames I was using to think this through. If you're a 501c3 organization, and there are millions and millions of 501c3 organizations, and there are some plain, easy, objective criteria for being one. And if you meet it, then you ought to be regarded as such. If the government, federal government, I'm just arguing by analogy here, were to say, listen, we're going to revoke the 501c3 status of this organization because we don't like what they're saying, I think that would be a pretty clear-cut First Amendment retaliatory type situation. You are, taking some sort of a benefit that is available to everyone and imposing some speech limitation. The other way you could look at it would be what's called the unconstitutional conditions clause, right? That you can't condition the receipt of some legal benefit. For example, being, a 501c3 or some objectively determined legal benefit on the surrender of some other constitutional right. You can't say you'll get this benefit as long as you play ball with us. That said, I think there would be a different analysis if you were talking about a special one-off type organization, right? It's something that in that case you're getting a special subsidy that no one else is getting. And then there was a case that I was reading in my other life that happens to coincide with this type of thing, where so the Supreme Court said, look, there was a company that was back in like 1986, some sort of fair election type organization sues the state saying, or sues the federal government, the IRS, saying, look, it's unfair that we have to be a 501c4. We want to do all these lobbying activities. And there were 501c3s. And if you, not to get too much in the weeds, but donations to a 501c3 are tax deductible. Donations to a C4 are not, even though both organizations are tax exempt. So they go to the court and they say, hey, look, this isn't fair. It's sort of an equal protection violation that these guys get the tax deductible contributions and we don't. And it's just because of the activity we engage in, which is lobbying Congress. And the court came back and said, well, come on. You've got a right to lobby Congress no matter what. The only question is, does Congress have to subsidize that right for you? And the court said, no, we don't, you've got a constitutional right, but it doesn't have to be, there's no guarantee that it gets subsidized just because something else that some other organization does get subsidized. So I would think there would be that kind of argument, that kind of logic, saying that Reedy Creek was something special, and what it was, it's not just receiving an objective legal benefit determination that like any other company would. It's receiving a special subsidy, and therefore there isn't a duty to subsidize it. But
and that would maybe potentially be weakened if there are other special districts.
If your fact is correct, and that those other organizations are comparable, then that's a bad fact for DeSantis.
But that said, we need to separate this out a little bit, because we've been pretty much focusing on, I think, the First Amendment issue here, right? The free speech right there. But again, there's also the contracts clause, takings clause, due process clause. And that basically, the argument here in a nutshell is Disney saying, listen, we had this agreement with this state board, and this was a contractual agreement. And so the government didn't like it. And so they formed a new board that voided those agreements. And now the Constitution does say that states are allowed to impair contracts if they're necessary to serve an important government interest. But as even, the Wall Street Journal asked this week, well, why is it exactly in the government's interest to cancel Disney's land development plans that it earlier approved? And saying, well, because they're too woke, that's probably not going to pass that test for an important governmental interest, essentially. And so,
and I'll tell you, I've sort of mixed feelings here, because I've always been a big fan of the contracts clause, but courts have not, and it's something that's always kind of frustrated me. Like you might even remember, we were in a con law class together
a million years ago,
back in the day, and I even made that the big argument, sort of in a pro Lochner, in defense of Lochner sort of thing, of saying, look, what about the contracts clause? And the response was, shut up. Contracts clause doesn't count. Courts never enforce this, and that's largely true. I would say there's very limited jurisprudence of courts actually stepping in and saying, whoa, 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 this is an impairment of contract and therefore unconstitutional. But, the facts may be there on this case. On the takings, unless...
I think that's a little weaker. Yeah. But I'd have to look more deeply into the specific arguments. But certainly, I think the contracts of the non-First Amendment arguments, that seems to me to be the strongest. I mean, I think you always throw in a due process thing or whatever you can. Certainly, and that can mean a whole bunch of things. But I guess to me, the larger point, Donald Trump, right, said, this is also unnecessary, a political stunt. And Donald Trump's calling you out for a stunt. But
and look, I know political stunts.
Yeah, exactly. But when you have a case here where, okay, the governor of the state has decided to go after the state's largest private taxpayer, largest employer, this is in what seems to be a pretty clearly anti-business sort of thing, just to what seems like to make a point to appeal to the anti-woke crowd. If you're any kind of like a traditional, Jay Carson or Paul Ryan type of conservative, you got to say, oh my God, this is really misaligned priorities here on the part of DeSantis.
Yeah, I think his miscalculation was he thought this could be a one and done. I'm going to whack him for being woke, and I'll get credit for that, and then this thing will go away. And I do think Disney outmaneuvered him.
And now we can't back off, presumably. I mean,
and shame on him for not seeing this coming, right? For not having the forethought to say, aha, if I do X, they'll do Y, and here's what we'll end up. So yeah, I think it's, and again, and I'll go back to my, where I was originally on this, that I think Disney's actions throughout the debate were reprehensible.
But not illegal. But yeah, you disagree with what they did, but yeah.
Yeah, not illegal. But what I'm saying is, and my point to what we talked about before is, I think Disney broke some of what are the unwritten rules of legislative lobbying and politics, right? It's sort of a pitcher thrown at somebody's head. If they do that, the other side's got to come back after you.
And I think you should, for people that aren't aware of that, you should maybe explain, because reprehensible is a strong word. Can you give folks a little bit of context?
Yeah, reprehensible, at least in my world. So I mean, when this was going through, in the legislative process, typically, everyone has lobbyists, and Disney more than most. And things are vetted through all these lobbyists, all these groups. And before something gets passed, you say, hey, are you okay with this? Or you have the hearings, and they either show up and they say, we're for it, we're against it, or we don't care. In this case, Disney said, we're okay with it. We don't care. And then after it passed, and some of Disney's employees got worked up about it, Disney changed its tune and came back and launched this big campaign about how terrible this is. And that's sandbagging, right?
I disagree.
That's not fair play.
I hear what you're saying, but
in the rules of that game.
I hear what you're saying, but I think it doesn't really fit into the traditional definition of sandbagging, because sandbagging suggests that there was a plan to do this all along. And I think a much stronger... That's fair. Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that there was a plan to do this all along. So
I
think Disney was forced into this.
To abandon their principles when they...
Yeah. I mean, Disney...
They weren't forced to do it. They just could have told their employees, hey, if you want to complain about this, feel free, but we're not going to do so as a corporation. This
gets into this larger thing about this ridiculous idea. Ridiculous is maybe a bit strong, that companies have principles. Their principle is to maximize shareholder value. And once it gets more than that, I think you get into just really kind of dangerous territory, whether it's on the left or on the right. And that's the territory we're in. Right. And so I don't think, Disney, their initial stance, I think, is their real stance. They don't want to take a position on any of this stuff. Right. They want to appeal to as many people as possible. They want to enhance shareholder value, just like Anheuser-Busch wants to do that, right? I mean, it's not like
I'm wondering, but I'm wondering if they do anymore. I guess that's
so.
sort of the question.
I think they just are trying to read the tea leaves and say, well, what's going to work with this market or that market, and how do we appeal to these protesters and those protesters? And because this is
exactly, but that's a different calculation than how do I increase shareholder value?
Well, I think they're related, right? Because you take the Anheuser-Busch thing, right? They try this thing because they want to appeal to a different sort of audience, broaden their market. It totally backfires. Now their top two people, these two top people behind this campaign, are on leave, and so this is new stuff for a lot of these companies, right? And so sometimes they misstep when they navigate it. And so that's why I would say it's not so much sandbagging as trying to figure out this new world where if you are a big corporation, it's really difficult to stay neutral, to stay apolitical on social issues as it was.
It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. And my sense is you could probably do that. I think it's probably easier than a lot of these corporations think.
Well, explain, because
would have been easier for Bud Light just to have kept a regular blue can.
Okay, now the Bud Light thing is a different issue, but also it's not like they had cans on the shelves or anything like this. Was that's maybe a bit of a different thing, right? Because they took a proactive step there. But
same thing with Disney though. Would again, the bill had passed, it was over. If you want to have your individual employees or your employer, I don't know if they're unionized employees union go and have a campaign against it, well, more power to you.
But then you say, but the problem is,
corporations say, look, we're sitting this one out.
Well, you can't, and that's the thing is, for better or worse, it's really difficult to do that because you have pressure from organized groups who can, create some problems for you. And I think that's what, with Disney, right, was facing, as they said, well, geez, we don't want all these people, because it wasn't just, well, some of our employees are a little upset. It's like, no, this is a big media thing. This could hurt our brand with a number of people who visit our parks and, watch our streaming service and all this. And so we should do something. And that's it. It's a difficult, and so I think it's really.
I think they're, as you pointed out, I think they're like Bud Light. They're miscalculating.
Yeah, and it'd be difficult to. I don't really think there is an option to just stay out of it like there was, because now too many people on various sides of an issue would say, no, we want you to use your clout, your economic might, your megaphone to push our issues. And if you don't do that, if you don't push back against what government's doing that we think is wrong, we're going to punish you for that. And so these are not pressures that
sounds like a terrible world, doesn't it? That sounds almost Maoist.
But if you think about it, we had some of it even back in the day, what with the divest in South Africa kind of thing, right in the 80s and that kind of thing, but not nearly as widespread as it is now.
We also had there was a guy who said even Republicans buy tennis shoes.
Yeah. But I think
that was Michael Jordan.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
Younger listeners, but
But I think the scope of the conflict has just been expanded, right? And so this idea that you can stay on the sidelines, which I'm sure Disney and Anheuser-Busch and all these companies would prefer to do, it turns out that's not nearly as tenable in the America of 2023 as it was in 1993 or something like that.
Isn't that does that concern you at all though? It scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, well, I'm of two minds. I understand both people on the left and on the right who say, listen, we are fighting for important things. And if these things really matter to us, whether it's transgender rights, whether it's making sure that unborn children are saved, however you want to put it, if we don't do everything in our power, including leveraging the economic power of groups that could help us, then we are actually complicit in perpetrating a great wrong. That's the logic of zealots on both sides. And so I understand where those people are coming from, but as somebody who is generally temperamentally, maybe in a lot of ways, not so much a zealot, at least there are times, but I think that definitely is a destructive thing if taken too far. And so, yeah, I understand your concern, certainly, but I also see
but
where
you
these
don't.
people are
But
coming
I would say it does seem to be sort of one-sided in that you don't see corporations or people calling on corporations to say boycott California or New York because they have extremely permissive abortion laws, or let me think of another. Boycott X state because they don't require voter ID. Boycott or hey X company, why aren't you weighing in on this issue to require voter ID in our state? It seems that the ratchet turns one way.
Yeah, and I think the argument here, you're right. I think largely you're right. There you can find some other contrary examples, but largely I would agree. Now, the response to that on the left would be, well, yes, and that's because the status quo tends to favor oppression of minorities and these groups that have been kept out of the conversation. And so therefore, of course, the ratchet's going to only go one way because the system actually has designed or has been
the arc
evolved.
of history bends towards justice. Yeah.
Well, the arc of history, the arc of history doesn't bend toward justice unless people push it that way. And so, power gives up nothing without a struggle or something like that. It's the Frederick Douglass quote that I'm. But I guess
but here's the thing: if you're and this is sort of a little off topic, right? I didn't get to talk about the Bud Light stuff last week. If you're Joe Sixpack, who's coming home from work at the Ford plant and just wants to sit down and drink a Bud Light and watch the game, he doesn't necessarily see himself as the oppressor.
No,
he doesn't necessarily see himself as some racist homophobe. He's just a guy who wants to drink a beer and watch the game without getting a lecture. And I think that's.
But he didn't get a lecture, right? I mean, what happened was Bud Light, onto this specific case.
I understand it was a limited thing. Yeah,
it wasn't even a limited thing. It was just like creating some kind of vanity cans for this one person, right? And so some activists on the right decided to make it a cause. And so, yeah, Joe Sixpack wouldn't have known about this at all had not some zealots on the right decided to say, "Oh my God, look how awful this is. Stop buying Bud Light."
Well, is it zealotry though to say this is sort of ridiculous and silly?
I think it's zealotry.
That was my sense. I mean, again, my sense on the whole thing isn't. I don't care that Dylan Mulvaney sells Bud Light. In fact, I sort of salute her entrepreneurship. Right?
Sure.
I mean,
yeah. She's making a lot of it, all kinds of sponsorship deals, and hey,
yeah. But what bugs me, and this is on a broader sense, right? Is that there is this woke kind of social agenda that's got to be carried into everything, and that's, to me, it's a conservative value, right? Of why can't something just be itself? Why does it have to? Why should Bud Light even address gender issues? It's just like crappy beer. Why can't we just sell crappy beer? The same thing goes for, the NFL drives me nuts. I mean, with all of the end racism and yay, great, let's end racism. And we're going to wear whatever colors against cancer. And we're going to do I mean, why can't it just be about football? And to me, I think so many people are seeing this across the board in all these institutions, that it's sort of like, well, we can't just have, the thing as it is. It's got to be infected or injected with this other social commentary or social mission. And I think people take, I don't even know if offense is the word. But
well, yeah, no, I agree. Story. And that gets into, I think, a larger argument about that I would argue ties in with the decline of religious belief and people needing to feel part of larger causes. And so this kind of transfers into the
it's
social
almost,
political
it
realm.
Hurts. It's like an anti-de Tocqueville sort of thing, right? that it's like, well, you can't have the just your bowling league, right? It's got to be the bowling league's policy against racism and transgender. It's sort of, and I serve on a number of nonprofits, and it makes me bang my head against the wall sometimes, in that we're founded to do X and Y, but now we're doing all this other stuff that is driving people away who might be interested in doing X or Y, because they say, listen, in order to do this, you've got to sign on for all this other stuff that maybe you don't agree with. So it's sort of imposing more difference. But all that, that's a complete tangent.
But I assume you understand the argument for that from the people who are doing it, right? Is this is truly sort of transcendentally, fundamentally important. If it's that critical, that if there is a lever we can use to advance justice and we don't do that, then we're not doing our job.
Right. That kind of sounds like something Robespierre would say.
Well, obviously, you can take that right to a certain level. There's definitely, and I think that's where. I don't say you and I would disagree. It's probably more a matter of degree in which we would, but that you can take that too far. Certainly doing nothing in the face of what you perceive to be injustice is wrong, or at least you can argue that it's wrong. But there's a limit to when you do everything you can do, where the collateral damage you are creating is actually worse than the wrong you are trying to right. And it can be difficult to see where that point is, especially when you're so wrapped up in your cause, in your own little silo, that you just lose sight of the other aspects of the world and society. And that's where the danger lies. And that's where I certainly, I think, Burke was right in a lot of his reflections on the revolution in France and that sort of thing. So yeah, it can't be taken too far. I certainly agree with you on that.
So let me, I know we're over time, but this is something it's sort of point of personal privilege, just because this couple things sort of happened at the same time. My uncle passed away last week. And he was getting on in years and had some health problems. And but let's put it this way: he was what you would think of as a stereotypical Bud Light drinker. In fact, I think he liked it quite a lot. And my sense is he would not have been someone who was a fan of wokeism or transgenderism or Dylan Mulvaney, but I don't think he particularly would have hated or cared about any of those issues, right? He just wanted to have a beer, and that's what sort of struck me, is that the this sort of thing of my uncle, who would have looked at, he certainly would have rolled his eyes at a Dylan Mulvaney type thing and said, "Gosh, this looks goofy to me," but he's would not have hated, destroyed. We've got to stamp out transgenderism. That wasn't his issue. His issue was he just wanted to drink a beer and watch the game. And I think that's what troubles me, that there are a whole lot of people out there like that who don't really want to be brought into this fight. There was the NHL, I think, also had sort of a pride jersey hockey thing, and it's kind of like, can't, and I'm not a hockey fan, but it's sort of like, can't we just watch the game?
Or I would argue on the left, I would say, wouldn't it be nice if every NFL game didn't have to have a flag at the beginning, the big game, the flag the size of freaking North Dakota, and Air Force flyovers, and does it have to be?
And I would agree with you that no, I think a lot of times that is kind of silly. It's sort of over the top.
Exactly.
The difference I would point out is things like the national anthem and the flag were things that we had traditionally, as a country, as a society, agreed on, that there was sort of, those were unifying symbols that most people could agree to. Hey, this is something, hey, we may have our differences, Republican, Democrat, but we all support the troops, and we all salute the flag, and we sing the national anthem. Whereas these other social causes, and again, there's some just, it's one thing to say, hey, I'm against racism, and I am. It's quite another to say, well, look, I support the agenda of BLM, which I don't. And there's sort of a conflation between the two. And a lot of people see that and say, look, I'm not going to sign on for the one when it actually means the other. But,
or just the idea that having to take sides in all of these fights is just exhausting. And a lot of people are just not interested in doing that. Sure.
Exactly. Yeah. Why can't I just watch the game and sort of have that transcendent of, hey, we're all, Browns fans here or something like that. Right. And I think that's a shame that we're losing. And my last little point of personal privilege, does this mean if Disney can sue for a First Amendment violation, will the left concur that corporations have a right to are people for the purposes of the First Amendment?
Yeah, that's that's a good one. I think that's it. That's an excellent.
Is Citizens United now no longer illegitimate?
That's maybe a discussion for another day, but that is a great point on which to end. And we talked so much about this stuff. There's some great discussions. We didn't get into Tucker Carlson being out at Fox, Biden's 2024 announcement, the beginning of the Trump rape trial, and the whole big issue about Supreme Court ethics and all that. And we will be getting into that on the midweek bonus show, which Jay and I will be recording in just a minute. And
it'll be really good.
It should be. I'm really looking forward to it. And if you're a supporter, you're going to see that in your feed on Tuesday morning. If you're not a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one, because you get that. You get ad-free versions of all we do, other stuff at various levels of support. We hope you will check it all out. Go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us on Venmo or at politicsguys or through PayPal. And you can find all of our support links in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And if you would like to get all of our full midweek shows, but you just aren't in a position to be able to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I'm happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it definitely helps us out if you can spread the word. And that can be through subscribing, rating, and reviewing us on your podcast app, or by sharing episodes on social media. That definitely helps. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our most excellent executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you join us.